Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Wheeler Centre. My name's Sally Warhaft, and it's a pleasure to be here on a cold Thursday night and to see you all on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to any elders who are here tonight. We are thrilled to have our guest tonight here. He's on a whirlwind tour from Texas. He arrived yesterday and he'll be back there, I think, by Sunday. So we're incredibly fortunate to have Jeff Goodell with us this evening. He is a best-selling author, a contributing editor at Rolling Stone, and a 2020 Guggenheim Fellow. His books include The Water Will Come, Our Story, 77 Hours That Tested Our Friendship and Our Faith, and, of course, his memoir, Sunnyvale. But we're here tonight to focus on his latest book, Heat, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet, which you'll be able to get from Paperback Books with a signature right after we've finished. Please give him a very warm Melbourne welcome, but not too warm. Jeff, you write about the Goldilocks zone in your book. I have a very fragile Goldilocks zone of my own. I like a temperature between about, I would say, 19 to 23. And anything really much warmer than that, and I fade very fast. We all, meaning every organism, manages heat in a unique way. How do humans do it?
That's a great question. First, I want to thank you for doing this with me tonight, and to thank everyone at the Wheeler Center for hosting me. I'm very happy to be here. I was very excited to be able to make this trip to Australia, so thank you. How we manage heat is really important because our bodies, and the bodies of all living things, but particularly our bodies, are very kind of finely tuned machines. You know, we're maintaining a stable body temperature is really important to all of our functions, to our metabolism, to everything. And we all know that intuitively, because as soon as you get sick, the first thing the doctor asks is, do you have a temperature, right? And so that temperature management system, which is entirely, not in our conscious control, is a very sophisticated system that our bodies have. And the basic mechanism of how we do it is sweat. I mean, we are the only creature that has a sweat system like ours. I mean, horses have some kind of sweating, that kind of lather that people know who are around horses have seen. But only humans have this ability to sort of move and sweat and cool off as we're in motion and things like that. And the way that works is, as soon as our body temperature starts to rise a little bit, our heart starts pumping faster, and it starts moving the blood in our system away from our internal organs in our brains towards the surface of our skin, where as the sweat evaporates, it takes the heat away and it cools the blood, and that cooler blood then recirculates. And all this happens very quickly in our body. It's amazing how fast the blood transfers around. So it's a mechanism that works very well as long as you're within a temperature range that is manageable, right? And as long as you're in a climate that allows the sweat to evaporate. It's one of the reasons why wet heat is very different than dry heat in our ability to tolerate it. But that's basically the mechanism that we use, and it works until it can't keep up, and it's why some of us are more vulnerable than others. If you have any kind of weak heart or any kind of circulatory issues, it puts a lot of strain on your heart, and you get into trouble quickly. And I can go into more detail about what happens in that.
I'm sure we'll get there, and none of it is pleasant. A normal body temperature is 37. For me, I would define extreme heat as anything above that. When it's hotter on the outside than the inside of my body, I'm lying down. I'm certainly not, doing anything worthwhile. But how do you define extreme heat?
Well, that's a good question, and there is no simple explanation for that. There's no simple, metric that we can use for that. Just as there's no simple metric for people ask about, like, when is it too hot for humans to tolerate? It depends on, who you are, what your physical conditions are, what you're used to, whether it's dry heat or wet heat. But loosely, extreme heat is heat beyond what we are used to in the broadest sense to deal with. Mm.
What you're writing in the book is that the whole world needs to adjust to the heat that's here and the heat that is coming. You want us to think about heat differently in order to understand that as an active force. What do you mean by that?
Well, maybe the best way to talk about that is to talk about the genesis of this book. So, I've been writing about climate change for 20 years, and obviously heat has always been a part of that. You can't talk about climate change, global warming. Obviously, heat is an issue, but I never thought about what that really meant. And it was just an abstract thing that drove a lot of the things like sea level rise and other things that I write about all the time, but I never really thought about it. And then about 4 years ago, I happened to be in Phoenix, Arizona, and took a walk. I was staying downtown and took a walk on a hot day. It was about 44 C or something, and I walked 12 blocks and started getting dizzy, and I realized that if I had to go another 12 blocks, I don't know if I would have made it. And it occurred to me, wow, this is really dangerous. And I was in good shape, and it also then occurred to me that I'd never considered that before, and moreover, I didn't even know what heat was. Despite the fact that I'd been writing about it for a decade, I knew what temperature was. I could tell you, I knew that, 35 C is warmer than 32 C and all of that. But if you asked me to explain what heat is, I couldn't have done that. And so that was the beginning of the book. And what I felt that day in Phoenix is this heat is an active force. It is something that is, could kill me. And I'd never thought about it that way before. And I think that I, like many people, just think of heat as this sort of warming, this sort of gentle thing that, happens sort of slowly, and, yes, it'll melt ice sheets and do all that kind of stuff, but it's really this sort of slow motion dance that our atmosphere does. And I realized that day that no, it is like a bug zapper, that can kill you very quickly. And I realized that I didn't understand that, and most people didn't understand that, and as our climate warms more generally, we're going to see more and more of these kinds of extreme events. And that's the heart of what I was trying to do with the book.
We're seeing so many of them anyway. I was reading about the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires that were just absolutely terrible here in Victoria. And twice as many people died that day from heat as from fire, outside of fire zones. And I was thinking about it in relation to the way you write about the sort of invisibility of heat in a way. There's a chapter in the book where you write about a photographer who's sent off to try and capture heat in Pakistan, and how difficult it is to do that. There are all sorts of consequences to that invisibility. Talk us through what some of those are.
Well, the main consequence to the invisibility is that we don't register it in the same way that we register other kinds of climatic events, right? If there's a storm, a typhoon, a hurricane that's hitting where you're living, you see it. You see the trees bending, you see the roofs flying off of buildings. With heat, you don't. And you can look out the window and you can't tell if it's 30 C or 40 C when you look out the window. It's invisible. And so it changes our perception of this. And then, when we talk about heat, our language is very confused about it. We talk about global warming. It sounds like better beach weather. Global warming sounds like a fine thing. Who doesn't want to live in a warmer climate? A lot of people do. Scientists talk about 1.5 C or 2 C of warming. To most people who are not scientists or deeply engaged in climate, that sounds fine. 32, 34 C, what's the difference? And so we have a lot of confusion in the way that we think about temperature and the way that we think about warming. And we have a lot of problems in the media about how we deal with this. When I watch TV and they talk about heat waves, they often have images of people on the beach or kids playing in sprinklers, and it's just a very muddled messaging around heat. And partly for that reason, people don't get the risks of it. They don't understand that you can go for a walk on a hot day and die from it. And I think that as things are getting hotter and hotter, that's going to change in a big way. Because I live in Texas, a hot place, like Australia, a hot place. And we're getting into the range now, as I was in Penrith when it was 49 C, in 2020. And it is, it will kill you, right? And so these risks, I think, are becoming they're kind of new and becoming very urgent for people to understand what heat really means. Mm.
You've been to Australia quite a few times, and I'm interested in your observations of the way we as a nation, I suppose, deal with heat or don't deal with heat. Obviously, it's a big nation and there's lots of different weather patterns and so on. But even if we talk about Melbourne, in fact, even to start with this room, there's a line in the book somewhere where you say, I now enter every room that I walk into and I'm like a thermal engineer, that you see things that others don't. What do you see in a city like Melbourne?
Well, a city like Melbourne is a city like many big cities that is, not built for heat. It is a city of asphalt and concrete and glass and steel. It is a place that, is much hotter than the region around it because, of all the heat radiating off this infrastructure. It's a city like most modern cities that is dependent upon air conditioning. We build buildings now. You build buildings here that, you can't open the windows, that if the air conditioning fails, they become sort of, on a hot day, they become like death traps. I see a city that is engineered for a climate that doesn't exist anymore. And that is a big deal. And re-engineering a city like Melbourne, which is happening. Melbourne is doing a lot of things, trying to sort of reimagine itself, but it's a huge job, and it's going to take a long time. And the climate is changing very quickly. And, also talking about inner city of Melbourne is very different than talking about the suburbs and, the way the suburbs are developing. And, the lack of shade, the lack of thinking about impacts of heat in those kinds of places. So, Melbourne is, to me, very typical of a big, modern, progressive city that is nowhere near progressive enough to deal with what's coming.
I was looking at just the City of Melbourne Council's urban forest strategy, and you can read things like this in different ways, and at a first glance it looks fantastic that, 70,000 trees are going to be planted, and you think, wow, 70,000, where'd they put them all? Where would they find that much space? And then, of course, you think of other places. At Milan have planted 300,000, aiming for 3 million. New York City's planted 1 million. And there's an attitude, I feel, in Australia that we get with all things climate that is just lazy. Is it a fair reading, do you think?
So you're saying that tree planting is an indication of a kind of laziness?
No, I mean, I'm saying the urgency and the degree of it. That 70,000 sounds good, but when you realise nearly half of the trees we already have will be dead by 2040, and it's a barely keeping up. That in a rich country like this, 70,000 trees is nothing.
Nothing, right? And I want to be very clear. I'm very pro-tree. I love trees. I travel way out of my way and ride my bike way out of my way to go see trees. I'm a big tree fan. And I think every city should have 10 times more trees than they have. However, tree planting is seen as this sort of, we'll fix Melbourne. We'll just plant a bunch of trees and everything will be fine. And it's not that simple for a lot of reasons. One thing is that, it's one thing to plant a tree. It's another thing to keep it alive very long. Urban trees have very short lifespans because they get all kinds of abuse, from dogs peeing on them to people crashing cars into them to people carving their lovers' names in them. There's just lots of trauma that poor urban trees have to deal with. And it's also, a good example of the politics of tree planting is that, in the U.S., the Republican Party, the conservatives, conservatives is the wrong word for them.
We know who they are.
Yeah. But, they don't want to admit that climate change is happening or that we can do anything about it. They're very pro-fossil fuel and all that. However, when you get them pinned into a corner and they have to come up with some answer, as Kevin McCarthy, our House Majority Leader, just did 2 weeks ago, he said, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. That's how we're going to fix climate change. And of course, he's not going to plant 7 trees, but much less 1 trillion. But it just is emblematic of the politics of this, and that it's like, we have the good answer. We're just going to plant trees. And like I said, we need more trees. Urban greenery, bringing in more open public spaces that is not concrete and asphalt is all really good and important, but it's not the simple solution.
One of my favourite chapters in the book is the one on air conditioning, and you talk about Florida when air conditioning was mass produced, and it allowed a whole lot of people to migrate toward the heat to Florida, and of course it changed the political landscape of that state. Up until then, it had been very much a Democrat voting or leaning state, and that that heat can be responsible for so many changes beyond just getting hot and killing us. But a really big one is human movement, that people have tended to, I suppose, migrate towards it, but now we're going to see people having to move away from it. What did you learn in your research about that, people migrating with heat?
Well, that's a huge issue. You're right. And first, let me just say about air conditioning that, I think you could make a very strong argument that, air conditioning is even more important than the sort of invention of the personal computer or something. I mean, I think it dramatically changed our world, and it was very specifically changed the United States in a very powerful way. Changed the politics. Richard Nixon was the first to sort of understand this, and this whole sort of, as air conditioning became popular and cheap, you had this great migration of people to Texas and Florida and places like that, largely older, largely conservative. And, President Nixon developed this, what they called the Southern strategy, which was he was the first to understand that he could win an election by getting all these new air-conditioned old people, basically, to vote for him. And it worked. And it's changed politics in a big way. It's changed, development in America. I live in Austin, Texas, a very hot place. People lived there, clearly, before there was air conditioning, but it was a very different kind of life. And so air conditioning allowed people to think, kind of falsely that climate didn't matter, that you could just go anywhere and just turn on the air conditioning and we'll be fine. And, now what's beginning to happen, we've had this immense migration, just to speak about the United States, immense migration into these hot places because the real estate is cheaper, taxes tend to be lower. There's a lot, because it was too hot before, so there's not as much development there. There's been a lot of political incentives to get people to move there. I live in Austin where Tesla's big factory is. Austin is a boom town. So is Phoenix, all these hot places. But what's beginning to happen now, and is really the story of this summer, is that people are saying, anecdotally to me and more broadly, reading about it in the media and things, is it's too damn hot now. I can't, we all in Texas live these vampire lives now. I feel like a vampire. I go out at the night, or early in the morning. If I'm going to go for a run, I'm going to do it at 4:30 in the morning. And, it just changes all the rhythms of your life. My wife is helping take care of her elderly parents, and they can't go out during the day because she's concerned that if they get hot or something happens and they get stuck in the heat, it will kill them. So it's changing the rhythms of her lives. And so I think for the first time, people are starting to think, I can't live here. I need to go somewhere else. And that's what happens to all living things, right? We have these thermal ranges that we can deal with, and whether you're a butterfly or a software programmer, if you get into a world where you can't deal with these temperature changes, then you leave and you move.
Although you make the point too in the book that there's a big difference between a robin and an elephant,
right,
or a polar bear.
Right. Right. If you can't move, you die. Right.
And of course, the other thing that the air conditioner illuminates, but everything in this story does, is the inequality that heat produces. And so for the millions of people in Texas who don't have an air conditioner, or who have one but can't afford to run it, it's both incredibly dangerous and very, very miserable. Are we heading towards a world where it will have to be an air-conditioned world in cities like Phoenix or Melbourne?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's already, virtually impossible to live in a place like Austin or Phoenix without air conditioning. And as, we're moving rapidly into a hotter world, our world is heating up because we continue burning fossil fuels. Those fossil fuels put CO2 into the atmosphere, which is heating up our climate. And there's no signs that that's going to stop anytime soon, so it's going to get hotter and hotter. And so the divide between what I call in the book the cooled and the damned is going to get bigger and bigger, because if you have money and you can live in a place that, wealthy neighborhoods virtually every city in the world I visited tend to be shadier, cooler, bigger trees, more green space. People in poorer neighborhoods, whether it's in Austin or Chennai, India, they live in hotter spots with less trees, don't have access to air conditioning. And, you know, it's going to become more and more brutal, and more of a, you know, a life-risking experience to be in those kinds of places. And, you know, the other aspect of this, of the people who are most vulnerable are people who do work outside, right? And so outdoor workers of any sort, construction, carrying the post, delivery people, building roads, all this kinds of stuff are not going to be able to do that, or they're going to put their lives at risk doing that. And so can a place like Phoenix or Austin, you know, or Melbourne function at a time when, you know, people are dying as they're going about their outdoor work, right? I mean, we like to think that we could live in these air-conditioned bubbles, but these air-conditioned bubbles are supported by all of this other workers. And also, we're not going to air-condition the fields where our food grows. We're not going to air-condition the ocean.
Well, there's
right?
one guy air-conditioning his tomatoes, isn't there? But
yeah.
You don't think that's the future, right?
No, I don't think that's the future. And
The-
it would be one thing if, like in the United States, you know, in the middle of this Texas heat wave, our governor passed laws saying that no city or county in Texas can pass any laws themselves requiring shade or water breaks, because it would have too much of an economic impact. You know, it would slow down the economy. And Florida, just yesterday, DeSantis is trying to do the same thing. And, you know, it's just barbaric.
And
right?
it's profoundly racist too, isn't it, where these policies are happening. You tell the story of Sebastian Perez. Mm-hmm. Was he from Guatemala?
Yeah.
Who came to work in a farm and died in a field at work, and this you know, madness of people, that line, you know, no, he's from a hot country, you know, that they're used to the heat,
right?
And I mean, it's a racism as cold-blooded as anything we saw in the days of slavery, isn't it? That kind of treatment around conditions, particularly in your part of America. You write to, I mean, the weaponization of heat. Tell us what is happening at the dusting that goes on with people trying to cross the border, and the weapon of herding people into as hot a places as possible when they're crossing over into America. Yeah.
So, you know, I live in Texas and Arizona on the border. You know, immigration is illegal immigration. Refugees, migrants coming across the border is a huge political issue in the United States, as it is in many places, but it's particularly volatile right now in the United States. You know, there was Trump and the whole, you know, border wall and all that kind of nonsense. And I went down to Arizona to spend some time along the border and think about heat and how it affects migrants coming across and everything. And I learned that there's a deliberate strategy in the United States from our sort of structure of our border to funnel people who are trying to cross illegally through these extremely hot areas. So with this one area that I spent time at called Devil's Passage is this 70-mile stretch of desert between Arizona and Mexico, where, because of the way the walls and stuff are structured on the border, if you want to cross illegally, you have to go through this 70-mile stretch. And I went out there with these humanitarians who were dropping water and food off in various places. And it was a very eerie and spooky experience because it was like walking through a boneyard. You know, I had to be careful where I walked because, you know, I was warned that there were so many skeletons in the ground of people who had died. And so what is basically happening is they're using heat as a kind of killing force to, stop these migrants from coming through. And the New York Times just had a story 2 weeks ago about how the Border Patrol is using, when they catch migrants coming through, they'll put them in these sort of pens that are outdoors with no shade and with no water, and just let them sort of boil there on the border. So, the United States is weaponizing heat in a kind of awful way.
It's funny, Al Gore wrote a lovely little blurb on the cover of the book, and he described it as entertaining, the book, which makes me wonder what he gets off on, I suppose. I think what he means by that is that it's really well written and story-led, and the human stories are what enable us to really, I suppose, understand what heat does, but to delve a bit more into the not so entertaining side of this, and the tentacles of heat when you read it all in one story. And mosquitoes was another chapter that really grabbed me, partly because I've had dengue fever in India, where I lived and worked for a couple of years, and they don't call it, break bone fever for nothing. It's an horrendous illness, and you describe. I mean, it's in Florida now. It's spreading. All these mosquito-borne diseases are spreading. Tell us how heat is affecting the migration of these creatures.
Well, like we were talking before, every creature has its sort of thermal zone that it seeks out, and so when it gets too hot or too cold, the creature moves. And mosquitoes are the great example of that. They are, of course, highly mobile. They are very sensitive to temperature, and as it's getting hotter, it's expanding the range of certain mosquitoes, types of mosquitoes that carry dengue and Zika, and in fact, another kind of mosquito with similar characteristics that carries malaria. And so heat is an engine that is driving the spread of these vector-borne creatures that carry these diseases that are very difficult to control once they get into it. Once mosquitoes settle into a place, it's very difficult to deal with them because they are very mobile, very nimble, very, you're faced with, massive spraying of, awful chemicals to try to get rid of them. I mean, one place that's very emblematic of the way these changes are happening is Mexico City, which is, as you know, one of the biggest cities in the world. And it's always been cool enough so that there's basically been no mosquitoes in Mexico City. And my wife grew up there, so I've spent a lot of time there. And I've always loved the climate there because it's very, it's kind of this sort of dry, kind of coolish climate. But what's happening is that it's gotten just a little bit warmer. And just that little bit warmer makes the mosquitoes go, I like this. And they're moving in. And as they move in, they're carrying dengue and Zika. And so you're seeing the first cases of dengue and Zika. And when you have a city with a population of, 30 million people or whatever it is now, this is a huge deal. And there's no screens on windows. There's no, nets over the beds. There's just no awareness or public kind of education about how to deal with this. And so the consequences are enormous. And when you think about this with malaria in Africa especially, 400,000 people, mostly children, still die every year from malaria. As it warms, it's shifting the range of malaria into new places. heat as an engine of disease is a really important aspect of how we think about the consequences of a warming world.
The melting Arctic, I think you say that's the pathogens that have been frozen for thousands of years.
Right.
It's what keeps Bill Gates up at night. A famous optimist. That's the. That's the. So I mean, humans, we're clever, and technology's there. In some ways, I think for every problem that is being faced in heat, not every technological. So we have brilliant scientists and doctors, and it's always a catch-up, of course. We can make, technically, I suppose, we could make an air conditioner for every human being in the world if we can find a way to power them that won't destroy us. But it's obviously not going to be enough, is it? Because those problems of inequality, the connectedness of these issues, where you're going from the melting ice in the Arctic and God knows what's inside it, to Iran today. It was pointed out had a felt temperature of 70 degrees, something that any human being could survive for 6 hours. How do these problems, how do we start looking, well, not start, but how do we more urgently approach all this in a world that is more disconnected in a way than it has been for quite some time?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hardest thing about thinking about not just heat, but the whole climate crisis in general. Is these kind of cascading consequences of this. So, in this book, my idea, what I was trying to do was write about heat on a very personal level of what it does to your body, what happens in your body when you have a heat stroke, what happened to me when I was walking in Phoenix, what happens to Sebastian Perez, why he died in that field, what actually physically it does to you, and why it's dangerous. But I also wanted to talk about heat on a planetary scale, as the prime driver of all of these other climate consequences of melting ice sheets and droughts and bigger hurricanes and bushfires and all that. It's all driven by heat. So I was trying to toggle between micro and macro scale on this. And so the macro scales, some people have described my book as a kind of horror novel. I'm kind of, that's a little bit flattering, I guess. But the mechanics of what it does to our body is horrific, but the harder part to communicate is the larger planetary scale stuff and this idea of cascading consequences, right? So, right now in Canada, there's these enormous fires that have been burning most of the summer, and the wildfire smoke has come a few weeks ago, came all the way down the East Coast, turned New York City and Washington, D.C. The skies were orange. It looked like a set of Blade Runner or something, And, those fires are driven by heat. They're driven because it's been hotter in Canada, which dries out the soil, which dries out the trees, stresses the trees. They're more vulnerable to disease and they're drier when a fire does start, whether it's natural or somebody drops a cigarette or whatever it is, lightning strike, whatever it is, they burn bigger and hotter. They send the smoke down to New York. I mean, all of these things are cascading consequences of heat, right? And that is the hardest thing to bend your mind around is the way these things are connected and the way that small changes have big impacts. I went to Antarctica for this book, and a change of literally 1 degree in the temperature of the water in the Southern Ocean is having enormous impact on the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet, because it's allowing the water to get underneath the ice sheet and destabilizing these glaciers from below. And that will have huge consequences for sea level rise and for every coastal city around the world. 1 degree of temperature change. And so, it's so hard as a journalist and as a human being to grasp how these things are all connected. And I think that scientists are, that's the challenge in science right now too, is connecting all of these things. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you do it in this book. It's a really good book to understand its subject. What problem of heat, I suppose, is the most urgent? That needs attention. I mean, they all need attention now, but summer is coming. Most people used to look forward to it. My mother lives an hour out of Melbourne in a bushfire zone, and it feels like dread now. We're seeing what's happening in Canada, in Hawaii, in Greece, in Europe. I mean, it's everywhere, and it's our turn next, and it feels like it's just going to be this way. Forever.
Yeah.
So what's most pressing with these sort of cataclysmic events?
Well, what's most pressing is to stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, there's just no question about that. That's why we're in this problem. I mean, this is why our planet is heating up. The faster we get off fossil fuels, the sooner we can, slow down this warming. And I mean, I can't, overemphasize this. That is the driver of this problem. And obviously, we're not going to stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow, but we can stop developing new fossil fuel, production and things tomorrow, and we can do a lot better job of kind of reducing our emissions very quickly. And we're just not. We're talking a lot about it. There's a lot of, I've been to many of these, UN meetings here in Canada. You had a big election a year and a half ago, changed things. The rhetoric has changed, but we're still nowhere near, dealing with this in any kind of serious way. So that's number one. Number two is understanding the risks that we face. Like, I didn't understand the risks of heat when I was walking on that street in Phoenix. The family that I wrote about who died on a hike in California didn't understand the risks at all. Getting educated about what the risks are, whether it's about bushfires and where you live and what you can do, or whether it's about heat, all of these sorts of things. One of the things I've learned on this book tour is that, I live in this bubble of people who think about this and talk about this a lot, and with talking to a lot of journalists and others in the last few weeks, there's just a lot of ignorance, not willful ignorance, just ignorance. People aren't educated about it. One example is the idea that we don't have to worry about heat if you have enough water to drink. Like, you can go anywhere and do anything. Well, that's not true, right? I mean, water is really important, because if you don't have water, you can't sweat. If you run out of water, you stop sweating, and then you're in big trouble. But water alone is not going to save you. There are many, I talk about in the book, there's lots of research that shows, especially with firefighters and others who are fighting bushfires, who are wearing heavy equipment and stuff, no matter how much water they have, they still die of heat stroke, because you can sweat all you want, but if you're in a hot situation, you can't cool off fast enough. So there's a lot of myths about heat and the risks of heat that are really important to be educated about. And then the third thing I think that's really important is, changing how we talk about heat and how we think about heat, with doing things like ranking of heat waves. I talk about naming heat waves, but it's also on a smaller scale. You and I and everybody else who live in hot places, we need to be checking in on our family and friends, elderly people, young kids and making sure that they know what they're doing and that they know that it's going to be really hot next week. And is your air conditioning working? Do you have a place to go? Are you okay? We don't do that at all.
The naming heat waves is really interesting idea, and it makes a lot of sense. We name hurricanes and all sorts of other natural disasters, and there's been some testing on this now. Weird resistance by the scientists, of course, because they call it out correctly as PR, but it's the PR that people need. Do you think that will catch on?
I don't know, but I think that it's worth trying. I mean, it's more complicated than naming storms because storms are very straightforward. It's just about wind speed, right? Like how fast the wind is blowing is Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, Category 4. Heat is different. As I mentioned, there's dry heat, wet heat. So 45°C in a really dry desert is very different than 45°C in Darwin or something like that, right? So there's that. There's a question of places. At what level do you start naming heat waves? So if every day over 40°C in Darwin or something, you would have 15 or 20 named heat waves a summer, right? And if it's in somewhere much cooler, you would have maybe 0 or 1. So what is the threshold? There's a lot of details about it that need to be worked out.
Although we overcomplicate things too, don't we? Because I would say in every city and in every town in the world, there's someone in it who knows when it's a heat wave and could just call it.
Yeah. Well, that's true. And I do think it's an experiment that some cities and states are beginning to do, and I think that we'll see. I think it's a idea worth trying because naming is very powerful, right? I remember Hurricane Katrina. I remember Hurricane Sandy. When someone says Hurricane Harvey to me, I know exactly what they're talking about. If someone says to you, heat wave Lucifer is coming, you're going to be like, oh, this is probably pretty serious. And some people have half joked, or maybe not even joked at all, that we should name heat waves like heat wave ExxonMobil or heat wave BP, to give credit where credit is due, right?
Yeah. I think we've only had the one named Cyclone Tracy. I can't think of another named. Yeah, right. So they've been, but certainly not heat waves. What we do have, which I'm sure you know about because you're connected to the organisation, the Rockefeller, the Centre for Resilience, is Melbourne has 2 chief health officers who were appointed in October last year, which I think is double the number of anywhere else in the world. Tell us about why that's important.
Well, Melbourne does have 2 chief heat officers, and
heat officers.
Yeah, and a number of I don't know. I think there's 13 different cities around the world. It's an idea that has been, this Rockefeller Foundation Center that I'm involved with has been a leader in kind of helping to fund these positions and create these jobs, which are really important because it goes to this idea about messaging and understanding that I've been talking about. There are people whose job it is in a city or in a place to, educate people and to push people and to push the government to make sure that, decisions that are being made with, heat in mind. And people have asked, oh, well, what kind of power do they really have? And of course, they're not like a Supreme Court of heat that can overturn political decisions and things, but they're very powerful advocates who are raising their voices and helping people, urban planners, everybody, to consider this in their thinking about what is going on in the city and about how are we keeping cooling centers open? Are we, what kind of access do unhoused people have? Are we doing a good job of messaging and of doing a ranking or a rating system? You know, what is the long-term plan for Melbourne to think about how to build a cooler city? What about white roofs? You know, things like that, painting streets white. There's a lot of kind of practical ideas that can be advanced by these heat officers.
And a lot of complications, of course, come into that, don't they? The Paris rooftops, the idea of making Paris safe from heat would require really changing the beauty and the thing that probably most people think of after the Eiffel Tower of what makes it a beautiful city, that connecting living with heat, with culture and with history as well.
Right.
Is there a place that, you know, is doing this in a holistic sort of way? I mean, I'm sure there are people. We've got 2 chief heat officers, but we only have 70,000 trees. Milan's got 300,000 trees and no heat officer. Is there a place that is really impressive in thinking really holistically about how they're meeting heat?
You know, there are certainly places that are doing better and worse jobs than others. Phoenix is trying to do a lot of things because they're this sort of focal point for a lot of the talk about heat, and they're also the focal point for a lot of the heat. And I think that, you know, the city officials there and others are beginning to see, like, oh man, we're in trouble here. And even if your only view is like, how do we keep the economic engine rolling in a place like Phoenix, we need to do something about this. So they're, you know, doing all kinds of urban greenery stuff. They have a chief heat officer. They have all kinds of plans for cooling centers, things like that. So they're, I would say, you know, one of the leaders. Paris is doing amazing things by really working to green the inner city, restricting cars, making it much more pedestrian friendly, cleaning up the Seine. The Seine now you can swim in for the first time in 100 years or something, you know. Things like that, these sort of public spaces, developing public spaces. In Texas, in Austin, we have this thing called Barton Springs, which is basically a dammed up spring that has been turned into a giant public swimming pool. And things like that are so important. You know, everyone gathers around this place on hot summer days, and, you know, you can hear the sizzle of the bodies as they jump into this cool spring. And it's really fabulous, you know. And so developing and enlarging spaces like that are really important. Athens is trying to rebuild this Roman aqueduct to bring water into the city to help develop green spaces, because, you know, in Athens, water is a big issue. So there's a lot of interesting ideas out there, but this is very new. I mean, you know, for all intents and purposes, 5 years ago even, nobody was really thinking about this. This is just like a kind of, oh my God, what are we going to do kind of moment.
It's here.
Yeah, yeah. And it ain't going away.
I guess during COVID, one of the really, you know, awful things we were reminded of, we weren't taught it because we've had poverty and wars and all sorts of other things to teach us over the years, but that deaths just become normalised so quickly in human hearts. It's a very strange thing about our species, our capacity to care and our capacity to just normalise death. And I know I'm being a little bit bleak here, but it feels like this is going... It already is something that's normalised. The fact that, just even the example of the Black Saturday, we never heard about any of these people. That is this going to be the sort of the next great normalisation of absolutely needless tragedy? Nobody should die from heat.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk about adaptation, and we've talked about it a little bit tonight with trees and urban spaces and air conditioning and all these kinds of things. And we do have tremendous technological ability to, adapt to different climates. Obviously, we've visited the bottom of the ocean, and we've put men on the moon. I mean, we can deal with a lot of changes if we have the right money and, all these other conditions. But what I do really worry about is, not only this gulf between the sort of cooled and the damned, but this exactly what you're talking about, that adaptation will not take the form so much of planting trees and better green spaces, but simply more tolerance for the loss and death and suffering that will come with this. And that, a study just came out 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that, 60,000 people died of heat in Europe last summer. And that kind of thing will just be seen as, it's summertime, people die, and, we're sorry, and it's too bad, but it's hot. And they should not have been out there, and we'll just sort of normalize it. And not only will we normalize it, but we'll forget that we created this heat. This is, the reason that we're having these climate extremes, the reason Maui is burning right now is because of what we have done to our climate by continuing to burn fossil fuels after decades of knowing the consequences of that. And so the sort of, horror of that is that not only will we normalize the deaths and things and the suffering of all sorts and the washing away of beaches and all kinds of things, but that we will forget that we did it. That it will think that this is just natural cycles, and they're not. We have created this climate, and we are going to live with it, for better or for worse.
And the one thing that's not going to adapt very much, it seems, is the human body. You make that very clear in the book that there's, we can get used to, a warmer climate if we move a little bit, but without any discrimination across sex, across race. All human beings are pretty much equally vulnerable in terms of the human physiology to this. Yeah.
Right. There's
so
no
we're
racial
not going to
difference
adapt.
or anything like that.
We're not going to adapt as a species to this heat.
We are not going to, quickly evolve a better cooling system or anything like that. I mean, all of these changes are happening, at nothing like evolutionary speed. They're, we are... Whatever adaptation we're going to do is going to be, through our imagination and ingenuity, not through our changing of our sort of bodily systems.
Well, we have a lot of imagination and ingenuity, and there's, you wrote an entire book on, some of the schemes for, that human beings imagine that they can control the climate. I don't imagine you're really leaning towards, what is it they want to stick in, sulfur flakes or something in the atmosphere. The answer's not there, I'm guessing.
The answer may not be there, but it doesn't mean that we won't do it. Solar geoengineering is what you're referring to, the idea of essentially building artificial volcanoes. We know that volcanoes have an effect of cooling off the planet because they inject these little particles, sulfate particles, into the stratosphere that act as kind of tiny mirrors. And they work. They create a kind of sunshade for a little while. So there's this idea that, when things get tough, and it becomes clear that, we need to cool things down, that there will be an attempt to do this. And I did write a whole book about it about 12 years ago, and it sold like 3 copies because it was an idea far ahead of its time. But that time is coming closer and closer. And it's not really hard to do. It doesn't take, it's not a sophisticated thing. It's not like building I just saw Oppenheimer the other day. It's not like building a nuclear bomb or something. It's like one rich guy, with a couple of airplanes, a fleet of airplanes could do it. And so there's a lot of questions about what kind of governance system there would be. And it's a very, very, very politically volatile idea that, for better or for worse, and most people would argue for worse, but is gaining credibility and gaining traction. And right now, the real rub is, do we allow small-scale science experiments so that we understand better what the risks would be? Because right now it's sort of all climate modeling and theoretical. We know that basically it works because of the volcanoes are examples, but exactly what it would do to precipitation patterns and what it would do to monsoon and what it would do to just this sort of general distribution of heat and how exactly it would work. We could learn a lot by doing small-scale experiments. And right now, there's a lot. That's the flashpoint, is do we allow scientists to start putting some particulates up there and see what happens and study it and learn more about this. And I actually think that that's a good idea, because not the project, but of doing really good, legitimate science so that we at least have some better understanding of what the risks really are. But a lot of people would violently disagree with me.
Well, you've got a bit of a mixed record on your career timing. I noticed, Jeff, you left Apple about like a week before it just went. Didn't someone offer you some great job there and you said, I don't think this company's going anywhere, I'm going to work in a casino?
Yeah.
And the book we just talked about was a little bit too early. It's a bit of the Goldilocks. We're back to Goldilocks, aren't we? And well, this book was not too soon and not too late, but just right. You feel like you couldn't have brought it out actually in a month of a year, of a decade, of a century, at any more poignant time than right now. So congratulations. Thank you so much for coming to Melbourne and back to Australia. Keep an eye on us, I think... there's a bit to watch here, isn't there, with the Great Barrier Reef and everything else. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and have a safe and lovely evening and a safe and lovely summer, because it's coming. See you, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen.